Notice how both of our views include this extension blade.php. Now, it's not required, so if I renamed this to post.php, nothing at the moment is going to break. Give it a refresh, it all still works. Laravel supports it. But what is post.blade.php, and why would we add it? Well, as it turns out, Blade is Laravel's templating engine, and you're going to use it specifically in your views. So if your view includes blade.php, Laravel internally knows, okay, I need to compile this Blade syntax down to vanilla PHP. And I think you're going to like this. It makes it much easier to construct your views. For example, right here, this is the PHP shorthand for echoing out the title. Or alternatively, you could, of course, write it like this. With Blade, however, we could use two braces. So if I said post title, this is identical to this. And in fact, behind the scenes, this is going to be compiled to this. So if I were to remove this, come back to Firefox, refresh the page, you still get the exact same thing. But notice, if I instead had named the view posts.php, this isn't going to work. I come back, refresh, and notice it's not being parsed or compiled. So unless you have a reason not to, as a general rule of thumb, all of your views should include that Blade extension. Bring it back, refresh, and now it works. Okay, so on that note, let me show you something. We're going to go into the storage directory. Now, you won't reach into this directory too often, though it is useful for inspecting any errors or logs, which you can find here. But in our case, I want to look at the framework storage. And notice there's a directory for views. And notice they are the compiled vanilla PHP versions of your views. Have a look at all of these. So for example, it turns out this file right here is the compiled version of what we did here. And I'll prove it to you. If I say test, I'll come back to Firefox, give it a refresh, that will recompile, and let's see, there it is. So all of this to show you that when you do things like this, ultimately it compiles to this. And this E function is just for encoding. But actually on that note, let's go back to our view. And let's actually go into resources, views, and view a single post. If we were to replace this, like we learned with post body, let's have a look here. It may not quite be what you want. So come back, we'll have to remove that test. But if I view the post, notice it's being escaped here, which isn't quite what we want. I do want this treated as HTML. All right, in those cases, we use this syntax with 2 exclamation points. And if you forget, I often think of the exclamation points as sort of like alerts. I hope you know what you're doing because we're not escaping this. So if I come back, refresh, we're back to where we were. And this is what we want. We're in control of that HTML, so I'm not worried about it. But yeah, if you're dealing with user-supplied content, you will need to take the proper precautions. Okay, so let's update this as well. Post title. Let's go back to our main view. Scroll on down. This is not HTML, so I can say post excerpt and then get rid of test. And all of this is going to work as it did before. But yeah, notice even things like this, it becomes so much easier if I can instead say post slug. And that should work as well. Very cool. Now, we're not limited to basic echoes. What about right up here? Instead of writing that out, where I always end up making a typo, I could instead replace that with this, the @ symbol. This is technically called a Blade directive, but you can quickly understand what it does. So notice how much nicer that is to write versus this. Even if it doesn't seem like it, I promise you're going to appreciate this syntax. So I give it a refresh, and yeah, we still get the same thing, because as you've learned, it's all being compiled to vanilla PHP. Let's have a look one more time and see if we can find this one. There it is. Now there's some extra stuff here that might be confusing, but it's still effectively iterating over the posts. It's just adding some extra things that might be useful to you. For example, you'll see it creates this variable loop. And here's what that does. If I come back to my view, why don't we right here, die and dump the loop, or Laravel has a Blade directive called @dd. So you'll find lots of little shorthands like this. Okay, so if I come back to Firefox and refresh, notice that Laravel, when you're inside of a loop, gives you access to a loop variable with information about the loop. What iteration are we on? How many more loops do we have? How many items do we have total? Is this the first iteration, or is it the last one? Is it odd, or even all of that stuff that you will often reach for, especially when constructing your HTML, can be accessed here. Which means sometimes you'll need to do things like, well, I need to add a class where we add margin bottom of 4 or something like that, but only if it's every other item or every third item. Well, the loop variable makes that easy enough to access. Just say, well, is this, and switch back, let's say even. Is this iteration even? If so, add your margin bottom, otherwise don't. And in this case, MB6, it might as well be foobar, it's nothing. But if you have a look in Firefox, let's see, this first one is odd, this is even, so it has the class, odd, and this is also even. So again, things like that become incredibly simple to construct. So when it comes to Blade, this is effectively what you're getting. Now, of course, there's much more to it. There's many directives, there's Blade components, there's Blade layouts, but it still kind of revolves around this basic idea of a layer on top of PHP to make common operations simpler. And then ultimately, it is compiled down to vanilla PHP. Now, at this stage in your learning, you can basically assume that any common PHP operation you might need to do has a directive equivalent. For example, if you might say, well, if some kind of condition, then I need to echo out some HTML, you can instead wrap it like this. Just make sure when you take this approach, you have to tell Laravel where the end of the conditional is. So you will always have a companion below. Notice if followed by end if. For each followed by end for each. And then there's even other ones like the opposite of if, unless. Unless such and such happens to be true, perform this logic. And in that case, you'd replace it with end, unless. It's very consistent in that regard. Okay, so now that you understand the basics of Blade, next we can learn about creating layouts.